part of what I do involves, as I said, looking at bees, looking at photographs of bees and trying to identify them. And then I send the records then to the Biodiversity Information Service in Breconshire. So the records are kept there, and then I will then look at all the records that have come in for the 2 counties at the end of the year, and I will look at the person who sent the record, whether there's a photograph with it, and I'll say whether I'm happy that that identification for that location is correct or not. So I have the sort of the final say really, because that data set then goes into the national data set, and that national data set then goes into the global data set. So there's quite a bit of responsibility with it that I do get it right. And sometimes you have to say that you don't actually know what something is, because you can't actually see it. It's similar to another species maybe. You have to actually maybe look at it closely, especially some of the solitary species, the very small ones. Some bees are sort of that tiny, and some of them store pollen in different ways. Some of them have hairs in different places, different coloration to their integument or their skin, if you like. There's so many different things that you need to look at. And sometimes you just can't do it from a photograph, and sometimes you just can't do it from a description. If I get a record sent in, or there's a record on the database for that year that is probable, and the person who's seen it, I know them maybe, and I know that their identification skills are very, very good, then I'll very happily accept it and say, yeah, that can go in. So there's quite a lot to it really. And then in another job, I do a day a week as a nurse, and the other 4 days I work for Radnorshire Wildlife Trust with a project called Green Connections, working with community groups, and doing pollinator training, which is really nice. You don't need to be paid to do that, it's lovely. So, right, you'll have to just stick your hand up when we get close to the time, because I will go on. I'll warn you now. Okay. If you've got any questions, you can stop me there and then if you like, or you can wait till the end, I don't mind, but we'll have a bit of questions at the end if people want. Okay. Glasses on, glasses off. Right. So I've got what I'm going to call the big 6 here, which are our commonest bumblebees. There is a 7th, which I'll come to in a moment. As I say, I think it's best to learn the common species, because if you see something unusual, though we do get aberrations saying that, we do get bumblebees that are sometimes a little bit different. Maybe something's happened to them in the larval stage, maybe this has been a change of temperature, or there's just a bit of a DNA sequencing issue going on. So that can affect how the bumblebees turn out. We also have cuckoo bumblebees, just to make it really interesting. They're part of the 25. So we've got 6 cuckoo bumblebees as well, which try very, very hard to look like these 6 species of bumblebee, but they do look a bit unusual as well, because they're not a complete copy. So that's something else to bear in mind. So sometimes you'll see a bumblebee that looks like this, but there might be something a little bit quirky about it, and it might be one of the cuckoo species. But I can talk about life cycle and cuckoos in a little while. So the main 6 common bumblebees that we get in Wales are these fellas here. So these are all female bumblebees. Some of the males look different than the females. Some of the queens look different than the females. But these are all queens, okay? So knowing the caste, you might think, well, why do I need to know that? Because when you put a record into me, all I need to know is what species it is. But if you're trying to identify a bumblebee, you will need to know whether it's a queen, a female, or a male, because sometimes those differences can help you identify them. But this isn't about identification today. I'm just really going to talk about bees. So these are all queens. So here we've got the common garden bumblebee. It's one of our bigger species. It's not that big, obviously. It's one of our bigger species. It's got a white tail and it's got 3 yellow bands. Nice and distinctive. It's got a long tongue, and it goes for things like foxgloves. So you'll see this big bee on a long corolled flower. That's what they like, and they get right in. They're around now. They usually appear around sort of late May. So they're not one of the first ones that comes out, but they're around until sort of the first frost, usually. Actually, this bumblebee, males, females, and queens, do all have the same colouring. So that's an easy one. That's garden bumblebee. Then we've got early bumblebee here, which is one of our smaller bumblebees. And the males can be really quite tiny. If you see a little tiny, sometimes it looks like a little black bumblebee. It could be an early bumblebee, one of our first species to emerge in Wales. And the males have a yellow fluffy face. Other than that, they look the same as the queen and the female. The queen and the female both look like this. They're short-tongued species, and you'll find them on open kind of flowers, you know, with lots of little stamens on usually, because they're small bees, so they want small flowers. In the middle, we've got buff-tail bumblebee. Again, this is a queen, and you can see that lovely buff tail. One of our first species to emerge, usually come out about February time. Nice buff-tailed queens, and you'll see them usually they're quartering over the ground looking for nectar, because she's been hibernating all winter, so she's looking for some food. But then once she has found some food, some nectar, maybe in a crocus flower or a snowdrop or whatever she can find early on in the year, she'll then be looking for a nest site. And usually all of these species will go to ground to nest. They all hibernate under the ground as well, but they also nest either in tussocks or actually in an old mouse hole often. They'll find the pheromones of the mouse and they'll actually go into the hole in the ground because it's been dug for them. She's not going to make extra work for herself, so into that hole she goes. She can smell the mouse, the old mouse hole, in she goes, and she'll use the moss to actually make a little nest for herself. Once she goes to ground, she'll actually start to provision that nest ready for the workers. We'll talk about that in a minute. The only thing about this bumblebee, if you're trying to identify it, is that once the queen has made her nest and she's in there, the worker bees have white tails. So the workers then start, when they emerge, to look like the white-tailed bumblebee. And they are difficult to tell apart. They've got two yellow bands and they've got a white tail. But you can actually tell them apart. Well, I'll show you in a minute, but it's the yellowing colour that can help a lot. And sometimes the workers of the buff tail can have like a little smudge of that brown. Some people have called it a tea stain, which I thought was a really nice description. And you can see that on the bumblebee, and that helps you think, actually, I think that's a female buff tail with a white tail. Okay, you all with me? So the white-tailed bumblebee queen here, really lemony banded often. There's three of them, but we just call them, bombers we call them ag. We just lump them all together because as far as we're concerned, without DNA analysis, it's just a white-tailed bumblebee. That's as much as we can do, and that's fine. She looks very similar to the other one, as I say, apart from the lemony banding. Nice big bumblebee, nice and furry, very rounded, and again quite an early species that comes out sort of late February and March. Red-tailed bumblebee, that's a nice easy one, isn't it? Woodland edge species, often you find them under hedgerows, they'll be nesting under there. Nice red tail. There's a couple of other bumblebees that look like that, but they are slightly different. That's a queen, really black, nice red tail. The red tail is about a third of the way up the abdomen. We do have mountain bumblebee, which is actually round here. I've seen lots of them on Ellen Valley Trail, and have them in the garden. They're around, you know. We're finding them now because people have had a bit more tuition about bumblebees. They know a bit more, and so we're now getting records of these mountain bumblebees. And they're in people's gardens. They're not up in the mountains at all. I had one the other day in my garden on lobelia. So, you know, all the things about them needing heather and needing to be so high up in the mountains doesn't seem to be like that at all. It's very interesting actually to know that they're actually quite common. They were what we called a biodiversity action plan species up until about 4 years ago, and then suddenly people started recognising, sending pictures, and were like, that's a mountain bumblebee. And you know if you've got a mountain bumblebee because that red is over halfway up the abdomen, so it's got quite a big red tail. Often they've got a yellow band as well, similar to this across the collar area. Oops. And then last but not least, we've got common carder. Yeah, you've probably all seen them. Nice brown bumblebees in the garden. Usually have quite a lot of black on the body. There'll be black hairs, and they'll be around until October. They come out around June time. They're not one of the early species that we see. But what we're finding with climate change is that some of these bumblebees are not just having one brood and then the nest is over and then there's a new queen and she goes to ground until next year. What's happening is that these bumblebees are actually having 2 and sometimes 3 nests. So there'll be 3 generations of queen. In London, they've got buff-tailed bumblebees emerging in January. There'll be new queens in June, more queens in October, and they're just not hibernating at all. They're just carrying straight through. And that's because they've got flowers, you see, in these inner city areas. People have got, window boxes and planters and things, and so they're able to find food, so they're just keeping going. So yeah, times are changing for our bees. So there we are, there's a buff-tailed bumblebee, 2 yellow stripes. I always think it's like a dirty yellow, and that buff-tailed big bumblebee, that's the queen. And then we've got 2 lemony coloured stripes and a white tail. Big species again, and that's the white-tailed bumblebee. The males and the queen look the same, very similar, obviously size difference, but the males have big yellow fluffy faces. There's lots of males around at the moment. Is it easier if I sit down rather than bob backwards and forwards?
Do what makes you happy.
Okay. Am I disruptive going backwards and forwards? No, is that okay?
You're worrying too much.
Am I? Okay, well, I'll stop. So, we've got a new fella on the block, and this is tree bumblebee. So this came into the country in 2001, first found in Winchester, and now they are everywhere. Very distinctive. I don't know if you've noticed them before, but they're quite easy to identify. All of the cast, the males, the queens and the females, all look the same. So they've got this foxy red thorax, a nice black abdomen with a white tail, just 3 colours.
I saw one in my garden, tried to identify it and couldn't because my book is from the late 90s.
Ah, there you go. There you go.
4 years before they were here.
But yeah, they're distinctive and they're everywhere. They do nest above the ground, which is one of the reasons. It's a generalist feeding species, but that's one of the reasons that we think that they've done so well, is because they're in bird boxes, they're in roof spaces, they're nesting in there and they'll overwinter in there. So when we've had these poor weather events over the last, 10 years probably now, we've had lots of times of flooding, both in summer and in winter. So when they're hibernating or they've got a nest, a lot of our native species have been flooded out. These little chaps up in their bird boxes or the roof spaces have got away with it. So they've spread right through the country, and they're apparently now in Iceland. So they're doing really well. Saying that, there haven't been many sightings this year for some reason. Can't quite work out why that would be. But yeah, quite common generally speaking. Sorry, what are they called again then? Tree bumblebees. So the clue's in the name, tree, they like to be up high. Which is excellent for us. So then we've got the honeybee. They are in the wild. You do get wild populations. I haven't seen many, but I've started to see more in the general countryside over the last few years when I've been surveying. Sometimes they're coming from people's hives because they will travel a short distance, up to about 5 miles, to find food. Quite distinctive. There are hoverfly species that will mimic these. There's 9 hoverfly species that will all pretend that they're honeybees. And they do a good job actually, because these little chaps, I think when they're flying, they dangle their legs. I don't know if anybody's noticed that. Usually they fly with their legs hanging down, as you can see in that picture there. But the thing that tells you it's a honeybee is this long submarginal cell here. So if you actually, get your hand lens and look in close, and you've got a honeybee in a pot, And you can see that, that's the only bee that's actually got that. Of course, bees have got 4 wings, hoverflies have got 2 as well, that's your other clue. Honeybees, they're really competitive with our native bees. They've got these really big pollen baskets on the back that they can pack loads of pollen into. So very good foragers. So yeah, that's our honeybee. Don't know much about honeybees. There are beekeeping associations in Wales that can tell you a lot more if you are interested. Oh, and they have hairy eyes as well. I don't know if you know that. They've actually bands of hairs on their eyes, which helps you distinguish them. So habitats for bees, bits of rough area where the bees can actually get into nest, get into the scrub, get into the ground. There's a little pond in there for them to go and get some water. So if you can bear to sort of leave a small area of your garden, or maybe your whole garden, just let it go a bit wild. It's all good for bees. Different sizes of flowers are very useful, but they can nest in there. They can get into there, and they will use somewhere like that to nest in. This is somewhere that I surveyed in North Wales, a little bee garden that they'd created, a community group, and it was brilliant. They had thought of everything. They got patches of ivy for the autumn. They got lots of spring flowering bulbs for when the bees come out and when they emerge. They built a bug hotel, which was actually in the sun. Some people build sort of bee hotels and they put them in the shade. Well, that's actually no good for bees because bees like to be warm. They need to warm up so that they can get their flight muscles going. So that was actually in the sun, so that was really nice. And the local school kids had built that. So, and they had lots of flowers all throughout the year. This stone wall was full of mason bees, solitary bees. So it really was a nice little place. The lawn, they had short areas of grass and areas of long grass, so they thought of everything. The short grass and the bare ground is also good for some of our solitary species. We've got certain species that like to nest in the ground, and they will exploit those areas of bare ground. So if you can bear to leave, some very short grass, or your path is worn away, don't worry about it because there are bees that will use that. This is a meadow up in Valley, not far from here. Found a nice rare bee here some years ago. It was on a bank and using all these nice composite flowers. So really nice, lots of floral diversity in there. And as I say, it was full of bees. We can't all have gardens like that, can we? The only problem with hay meadows, though, everybody thinks they're fantastic, and they are. The problem is that when they're cut, the way they cut them at the moment anyway, whether that'll change, they're taking the whole lot of those flowers away in one fell swoop, which means that the bees are like, where's the food gone? So I think they need to change practice, really, and start treating their hay meadows differently. Maybe rotation would be an answer, so that they've got 3 meadows maybe, or they split the meadows into sections and they just take certain bits of the meadow at certain times, or they take one of them out and leave the rest just to go sort of fallow into the autumn. Like they used to do. We used to have rotation of our crops, didn't we? And that would be really helpful for bees. They're great for some of the time, but the way that they're managed isn't always the best. It's not a very good picture, is it? But these grasslands, just again, this was actually taken in Portugal, and again, it was covered in bees. And of course, the grasses are good for butterflies. Lots of butterfly species will lay their eggs on the seed heads of the grass. And again, they were taking all of this out at the end of the month. So all of that, food source was going to go. But another good space for bees. This is a white-tailed bumblebee. Looking at the picture, I think that's probably a buff-tailed female, because the yellow of the bands is quite mucky-coloured to me. Anyway, everybody sees colours differently, and as artists you probably know that, but generally speaking, it is dark. And I put robin bees because some of the bees that haven't got a long tongue, they want to get into that honeysuckle flower to get to the nectar. they actually cut little holes in the petals, and they'll actually get at it that way. And if you look at sometimes honeysuckle flowers especially, you might see some little holes at the bottom of the flower, and that's a bumblebee trying to get in there. A bit cheeky really, but they will do that. So I said I'd mentioned cuckoos. These two are cuckoo species, pretending to be their host species. So I don't know if you know what a cuckoo does. Probably heard of the bird cuckoo, and the bird cuckoo goes into another bird's nest, and they hoik out the eggs, and they put their own fledgling, their own eggs in there, which turns into a fledgling, and the parents raise it. So these cuckoo species are doing the same thing. The life cycle, actually, of our bumblebees starts at the end of the year, usually, or halfway through the year, when the queen bumblebee that's gone into the nest and made the nest and then started to lay eggs, she will mate with a male, the new queen, and then she'll go to ground. She'll make an area in the ground, usually a north-facing bank, sometimes an old mouse hole. She'll go in there and she'll just hunker down, and she'll stay there all winter. She's fertile, she'll wait for the warmer weather. She'll emerge, and then she finds a nest site, she'll go in, she starts to lay eggs, the eggs hatch, and then she doesn't leave the nest. So the female bees she will lay will come out as worker bees or females, and they'll start to forage, and they'll bring back the pollen on their hind tibia, the pollen baskets. She'll bring it back, they'll scrape it off into a little mound in the nest, and while the queen is sitting there laying more eggs and making more larvae, the larvae are feeding off this pollen and nectar mix, and then she'll just stay there. But what happens sometimes is these cuckoos come along about halfway through the season. The new queens will hatch out, and they will enter the nest that's already been established by the host, and they usually have a fight, it's sometimes to the death, or sometimes the actual host species queen will just go into submission, and she'll sit in a corner of the nest while the cuckoo takes over. So the cuckoo then just sits back really and starts laying her own new queens and males. She doesn't need any workers because she's got the workers in situ already doing the work for her. So her males will emerge and her new queens, and they'll go off and they'll mate, and the whole cycle starts again. They'll go to ground until the following year. The males die. Same as the host species. They lay females first. Later on they'll lay males. The males come out and will mate with new queens. So these two are cuckoos. They look a bit odd, don't they? This is Bombus vestalis. I don't think it's got it. Oh yes, it is called vestal cuckoo bumblebee. And it's got these sort of biggish yellow patches at the top of the white tail, which makes it a bit distinctive. And the other thing that you find with the 6 cuckoo species is they have darker wings, so they can look quite dark and smoky coloured, which is another way of sort of telling them apart. And the one over there, that is the red-tailed cuckoo, quite obviously, really. It's a very good mimic, isn't it? I mean, you probably wouldn't know that it's any different than the red-tailed bumblebee, but you can see that the wings are very dark there. They've also got quite a boxy-shaped head, and also they're not very fluffy. These cuckoos tend to be a little bit on the baldish side, and you can see there it's quite shiny on the thorax. So there's 2 of the cuckoos out of the 6. So it all goes on in the world of bumblebees, isn't it? So 25 bumblebee species, the rest are solitary, of which there are many kinds. Their life cycle is different than bumblebees because they're not social as such. They'll make a solitary nest, that clues in the name. They're making either a little tunnel in the ground, either in soil or in a bank. Some of them are aerial species and will make a nest in maybe a wall or a plant stem that's hollow. They'll go in there, and they need smaller flowers. You know, I mean, it's horses for courses with insects, really. You tend to find very small florets and stamens, and what the small species are on, and the bigger species obviously need bigger, blousier flowers. So that's, I think it's orange-tailed solitary bee, or Andrena hemorrhoa. A bee you can do in the field. It's not a very good picture, that, really, because you can actually see it's got a little orange tail when you see the whole bee. It's got a nice black shiny abdomen. It's got a really foxy little thorax there. About that big, generalist little bee, nests in the ground. So there we are. This is from my bee hotel at home. Just some bamboo canes, they are hollow, stuck in a box with some mesh over the front to keep the birds out, because if a blue tit or a great spotted woodpecker finds them, it's lunchtime for them. So the thing about the red mason bee, which this is one just about to go in, is that they will pack the tubes with bits of masonry, cement, soil. They'll compact it in. And what's fascinating about these little guys is that they've got a hollow tube, maybe that size, and they'll maybe get 7 cells in there. And they'll start with female eggs. They'll lay female eggs at the back, 3 or 4 female eggs. Each one is treated as an individual cell, and she'll pack it up. Then she'll lay another one in front of it, pack it up, and another one. So she'll lay her female eggs at the back, and then she'll go on, she'll change her pheromones, and she starts to lay male eggs at the front. So the males emerge, so they're ready for when the females come out. It's very clever, really. I mean, obviously they've evolved to do that. So in a way, it's the other way around than the bumblebees. So the bumblebees have the females first, and then the males come along later. But so there we are. So that's red mason bee. You may have seen them. Either, if you've got a bee hotel of your own, I don't know. These are also aerial nesting bees. These are our leafcutter species. I think there's about 7 of these, 7 different ones. But again, we'll use bee hotels. But what these little chaps do is they will cut a segment out of the leaf, and they'll actually, instead of where the mason bee packs the larval cell with soil or bits of cement or whatever, these will use a leaf. And you might see that sometimes. If you've got a bee hotel, you see a green leaf has been packed into the hollow stem, or you might see it actually in a wall or an old standing post or something like that. You might think, what's that little bit of green? And it might be a bit of green leaf because you've got a leaf cutter bee in there. So, and the other thing that's really good about it, can you see those big jaws? And they use those big jaws to cut the leaves round. So it's quite distinctive. They're different as well from the other bee species because they pack their pollen not on the hind leg. They actually pack it underneath the abdomen there. So all their pollen gathering equipment, if you like, is under their abdomen. Which doesn't help us really with identification because we need to see the colour of the hairs underneath the abdomen to be able to tell them to species. So they fox us really by covering it all in pollen. But yeah, lovely little bees. About that size. Some are bigger than others, some go that small, but some of them are honeybee size. So there we are, there's a mining bee's nest in the ground. You can see there's 2 next to each other. So they're solitary nesters, so they're making a solitary nest. But sometimes these bees will nest in aggregations. So we might get up to 50, 60 holes all together because they are the same species all nesting in one space, but they're still making a solitary nest. So they're still classed as solitary bees. But if you see that in the ground, you've got a solitary nesting bee. And here are some solitary mining bees that will nest in the ground. These are 3 different species. They all emerge in the spring. That one in the middle is a really easy species to record. It's ginger, really foxy red ginger, furry all over. You can send that record in quite simply because the males are not quite as hairy but still as distinctive. They like hawthorn, so you will see them in the spring. and that's one that I'd like people to start recording if they can. It's called Andrena fulva, and I'm just trying to think of the common name, it'll come back to me in a minute. So we've got other pollinating species, haven't we? It's not all about the bees. Beetles, they're pollinators, they'll move from flower to flower and take the pollen with them. We've got 4,000 species of beetle in the UK, so they're quite complex. But we've got butterfly species as well, they're pollinators. Moths, good pollinators. Some don't fly at night, some fly in the day. That's a silver Y, that's a common little day flying moth. It's called that because it's got a little sort of tick, a golden coloured tick I always think on the wing, which makes it stand out. And also when it flies, it's got very, very quick wing beats, so you can see them dashing around in the flowers. And that's a hoverfly on the end. That's a hoverfly pretending to be a honeybee. So it's doing quite a good job. But of course, our flies are built differently than bees. Flies have their eyes on top of the head. Bees have their eyes on the side of the head. They've only got 2 wings. Bees have got 4, and they haven't got a pinched waist. Whereas, so the fly looks sort of like that really, whereas bees and wasps do this, don't they? All important, you need them all. So plants for bees, if you can have a variety of plants in your garden, that will help them from right after Christmas straight through to December. Mahonia is very good for winter time. People often say, I don't know what to put in the winter. So Mahonia is good. Viburnum bodentense, nice little pink flower. That's a really good plant for December, January time. Crocus, bees, bumblebees especially love crocus, and they'll actually sleep in them at night. They're just, they're usually packed with pollen, you see, so they're really good for bees. That's lesser celandine there, that sometimes carpets woodland. I mean, you know, I think if you can just have a variety of flowers flowering throughout the year, at least if bees do emerge earlier than they used to, they've got something to actually start feeding on once they emerge. So it is important if you can think about that. And also with your flower shapes, if you can have something that's open rather than all closed in. I know some peonies are very closed, some dahlias, some are fantastic for bees because they're nice and open. Some of them are, you know, a bit closed off and they're not very good. And if you can avoid hybrids, they're not particularly good either. So that's just some ideas about open flowered shapes. So we've got a Strontia there, lots of little tiny florets for little tiny bees. We've got a viburnum, verbena rather, there. At the bottom, nice open shape. That's one of the yellow buddleias there at the top. Bees, butterflies absolutely adore that. And then just good old hawthorn there. Willow's a very good plant for bees if you can bear to have it in your garden if you've got space, because it's a nice early flowering flower, lots of little florets, and bees really like willow. So we've got foxglove, the longer corolla flowers for the bees with the long tongue, and we've got some hedgewing-wort, and then we've got pulmonaria. Now pulmonaria is an interesting flower because it flowers early on in the year, and it's also really good for our hairy-footed flower bee. And there it is, that's the male. And it's so called because they've got these really long, dangly hairs on the hind leg. That was in my garden 2 years ago. That was the first Radnorshire record for hairy-footed flower bee. And there was nothing magical about it. I just decided to put some pulmonaria in the garden. And it was there! It was so exciting. They go quite silvery coloured. The males have a yellow face and the females are all black. But just so you know, they exist. And if I'm on a bit of a mission to get everyone to plant some pulmonaria in their garden, and then in the spring start watching them and see if you can see one of these little chaps, and then send me the record, because I'm sure they are a lot more frequent than we know. It's just that people don't know they exist. So if you know they exist and you've got some pulmonaria, chances are you'll have one. And send me the record. This is Walcarda bee. They're around now. got a nice distinctive yellow face, they're about that big. And these little chaps really like lamb's ear. So, because they're called wool-carder bees, clues in the name, they're taking the hairs off the lamb's ear, packing it underneath them, and then taking it to the nest, and then they line their nest with the hairs off the leaf. The males look like, I suppose they're quite stripy, so people do think they're wasps sometimes. But the males will guard the lamb's ear, and they'll actually be hovering round a particular plant, just waiting for females to land, and they will actually take on other males and keep them out of their territory. They're quite territorial. So yes, these are aerial nesting bees as well. And that's it. So that's my email address. If people want to email me, send me any pictures directly, and then I'll try and help you with some identification. And that's a website that I've got, which is just me, really, just not affiliated to anybody else. And there's quite a lot of information on there about bees and wasps, and people send me nice pictures, and I say, oh, do you mind if I put them on the website, and I put them on, and so that we've got a bigger picture. People have got an idea what's happening in the county, because otherwise, you know, people go, oh yeah, it's a bee, you know, well, what do we know about bees? So I developed it myself, amazingly. It's not that good, but I did manage to develop it because I thought people have got somewhere to go, they've got somewhere to look. Oh, somebody in Howie has found somebody found a hairy-footed flower bee in the spring, absolutely made up, contacted me, yeah, can I put it on the website? So they are out there, and there's lots out there that, you know, we don't know because people don't know about them and are not recording them, but if you send them to me, we can get the data, and we can find out more about them and what they're up to. So that is a lot, well, quite a bit about bees in a nutshell, really. I could go on and on, as you can imagine.